Joshua, I appreciate you making this work today. And again, sorry about all that yesterday. Dr. Joshua Goodman from the State Archives of Florida. He has a presentation, Conquering New Frontiers with Rapid Digitization Technology, expanding and streamlining our mission at the Florida State Archives. Dr. Joshua Goodman is the archives historian at the State Archives of Florida in Tallahassee. He holds a bachelor's and master's degrees in history from Florida State University and a Ph.D. in history from Tulane University, New Orleans. At the State Archives, Josh manages the selection and digitization of textual records for the award-winning Florida Memory Program. He promotes the use of state archives resources through community outreach across the state. Please connect with the Florida State Archives. Josh, let me turn off my screen sharing and hand over it all to you.
All right.
You can take it away.
Okay, let's see. You should now be seeing my title slide. Is that right?
We see you very well. Your slide
very good. Well. All right, excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Pete. Thank you. I appreciate you guys having us today. Thank you for squeezing us in. We're just really pleased to be able to do this today, to be part of this roundtable. We've been really excited about the work that we've been able to do with digital transitions and with our equipment. And so it's going to be quite a pleasure to say a little bit about how our new equipment has been helping us, not just to do what we were already doing faster, which, believe me, that's quite enough for us to be really thrilled about that, but it's actually helping us to grow and expand the services that we provide to the public here in the state of Florida, and the way that we interact with the public, because it's freeing up a lot of time for us to get very creative about the way we do both imaging and cataloging. So there's that. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. It's kind of an interesting thing here, because and the reason why I'm able to sort of share some about not just the imaging part, but also kind of the way we use these collections as we get digitized, is in my role, it's sort of divided 50-50 between managing the digitization workflow for textual records, but then also managing our outreach with many of our constituencies, genealogists, local historians, chambers of commerce, anybody who might be interested in using the resources of the state archives. I've oftentimes expressed the mantra that archives are for everyone. So we're always trying to make the tent a little bit bigger. So that's why one of the reasons why we're so pleased with the changes that we've made in our workflow in recent years. We have a separate set of staff here at the State Archives who digitizes photos, audio recordings, films, and other things. So I'm pretty much just in the textual records department here, but believe me, we've got enough going that's quite enough to keep me plenty busy. So just a little bit about the repository and kind of how our work is structured. We are located here at the state capitol in Tallahassee, just a couple blocks behind our Capitol building. We are the official repository of Florida's state government records, as well as a number of other very interesting collections. A little more specific on that, our collection at the archives, and we do have a separate state library separate from the state archives. It's strictly split down the middle between unpublished and published materials. So state publications, our really rich collection of books, maps, a number of other AV materials that are mass produced. The state library handles all of those, and we focus very specifically on manuscript collections from both private and public sources. So the formats that are in the archives collection, it's everything from loose textual paper records to bound volumes of government records. You can see some examples of that in the photo here. This is one of 5 stack floors here that we have where we keep our materials. So it's a pretty sizable thing. We've got a handful of actual objects that are associated with our textual collections in some way. And then lots and lots of photos, more than 1 million historical photos dealing with Florida, and that number is expanding every year. Videos, audio recordings, and an incredible array of legacy formats, every kind of photograph you can imagine, from daguerreotype all the way up through born digital, and then some of the crazy audio formats. I mean, just a really diverse collection in terms of all of that. Now, the bulk of the collection consists of government records, since state law mandates that a vast variety of different kinds of records come to us. We collect from all three branches of government. So that's going to be the governor and all the different executive offices managing everything from education to transportation, fiscal record keeping, and all that kind of stuff. The legislature, everything that goes into the process of creating laws and establishing those, all the way from petitions going into legislators, individual legislators, all the way up through the official signed in ink copies of laws. We keep all of that stuff on site here at the State Archives. And then the state court system as well. So our Supreme Court, which is, they're our neighbors right across the street. We get we get records from them from time to time. And then of course, there are legacy courts that existed before the Supreme Court. We have their records as well. So it's a really wonderful, rich collection of materials. And as you can imagine, it presents a lot of digitization challenges. Lots of formats that are way too big for your standard flatbed scanners. And so that's something that we've been dealing with for a number of years now. I should mention that while government records are the focus of the collection, we also collect a number of local records as well. Most of those local records stay in individual county courthouses and their annexes and things, but we do get a few records from time to time for a variety of reasons, and we do hold those here. And then we also have a number of private manuscript collections that come to us from private donors, and that's probably, I'd say, maybe if I had to guess, maybe about 1/10 of the total holdings of the archives. It's not a huge thing, but I would say that the bulk of the Florida photographic collection that is now available on our website at floridamemory.com, that is, it's probably the bulk of the Florida photographic collection comes from private sources. So a really varied collection of materials. Now, so that's the archives itself. But then we get into the digitization arm. We have been digitizing materials since 1994. That's when the first grant was written. We got a good grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to start a digitization initiative. Those master scans from 1994, it'd scare you to death to look at them. You can be sure we're going back and rescanning a lot of stuff from the 90s and even the early 2000s as standards have changed and photographic processes. We've found new ways to really get the best images out of those. But yes, so the Florida Memory website, floridamemory.com, that is where all of our digitized materials get off to. We digitize primarily just from the State Archives of Florida. We do occasionally do partnerships with other institutions, but the way that we kind of do that administratively is we actually accession copies of the materials from other institutions if we're actually going to do that. So technically everything we digitize is a State Archives collection, and that helps us out big time with copyright and that sort of thing, because when an institution donates copies, digital or print copies to us of a collection, we go ahead and acquire copyright to those so that we can put that into the public domain. Anything that you see on Florida Memory is going to be in the public domain, or we're assuming fair use on it. So there's that. Now, in addition to the State Archive stuff, I also mentioned that we have the State Library as a separate institution. And the State Library has a number of very colorful and interesting and information-rich materials that are published. So ephemera, they have an amazing collection of political ephemera from campaigns going all the way back, I think as far as the 1870s. So we love digitizing stuff from that, pamphlets and brochures and things that got handed to tourists and potential home buyers as far back as the 1800s. We love digitizing all of that as well. So on the website, what I've done here is sort of screenshot the main menu for Florida Memory to get you to all the different kinds of materials we're working with. So you see all the different media and all the different kinds of things that we're going with. We have about 47 different collections. A couple of those are catch-all collections that contain, in some cases, hundreds of other collections. So for example, the Florida Photographic Collection pulls its material from probably more than 100 different manuscript collections that we've been collecting since the 1960s. And so, the 47 collection number is a little bit of a misnomer, but there's a lot there. There are at the moment 283,000 catalog records on Florida Memory. About 213,000 of those are photographs. So you're thinking to yourself, well, that's not a whole lot of other things, but it's important to understand that each of those, the way that we do our digitization and the way that we do our indexing, any of the textual catalog records that we have in there, it could be something as small as a one-page letter to the governor from somebody, or it could be as much as an 800-page volume of estate inventories or something. That's one recent, really big item that we added to Florida Memory. It's an 800-page estate inventory with a really complex index that's searchable and sortable and all this stuff. But the way it shows up in our statistics is it's one catalog record. So the numbers, it's always a weird game trying to explain to people just how big Florida Memory is, because a single item can have, hundreds and even thousands of pages in it. Pretty interesting stuff. So even with that hundreds of thousands of pages of materials, we only have about 0.5% of the total amount of the archive's holdings combined. But that's where we start getting into talking about how having digital transitions as our tech partner and getting our new equipment has helped. So we had been working for several years up until 2020 to get a digitization solution like what we got from Digital Transitions. And we did just acquire the PhaseOne IXH 150 megapixel camera sensor with the DT Versa digitization station. That is the good news, that we have that equipment and it is working fantastically. The other news, it's not bad news, it's just interesting news, and that's why I have this slide up here, is that we acquired this equipment in the midst of COVID. And so we had the great pleasure and the adventure, I might say, of setting up this equipment with, you can just barely, right over here on the far right hand side of the screen here, you can see that laptop there. There's actually a technician from Digital Transitions who was watching us as we set this up ourselves. Normally they would have come to visit us and help us set this up, but we actually, the program director for Florida Memory and I, we came in all masked up and got this going on our own. So we're very excited to have this going. And so let's talk a little bit about how this has changed what we're doing. The old workflow for us, from the time that we got things, the time that we discovered something really cool on the shelves that needed to be digitized, to the time that everything was imaged. And of course, this doesn't even touch the cataloging process. That's something completely different. We were using a variety of traditional flatbed scanners. We had one wide tech, as well as we were using a couple of Epson Expressions scanners. And then we had experimented with a couple others as well, the wide tech Bookeye and things like that. But those, of course, limited us to either we could get away with doing much smaller physical media, or in some cases, we would never do this with photos, but we certainly did it with textual records. We would take multiple scans and stitch things together. And then, of course, we would bring those into Photoshop to do the basic editing. And then we used a utility called Advanced Renamer to, if we needed to, if we had brought in a massive number of things and maybe we needed to do some renaming and some file structuring, we would use that program to do that. We were using View. I noticed that Ott who spoke with us earlier from Estonia, was using this program as well, View, to make all of our derivatives. We were saving, our preservation masters are in TIFF, and then we make several different kinds of JPEGs for use on the Florida Memory website, which uses an Omeka installation, a very heavily Frankensteined Omeka installation, I might add, to keep up with those 283,000 catalog records. Then, of course, everything would go to the server. As you can see right now, this process, while it worked for a number of years, it's highly involved in terms of the number of different software solutions that had to be used in order to make this all work. We're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4 minimum, and that's before we start talking about web utilities and things. Here's where things go now. So getting a collection off the shelf we are now imaging entirely with the PhaseOne for textual records, photos and films and audio recordings. Of course, that's a completely separate workflow from our end of the shop. But for textual records, we are using the PhaseOne for essentially all imaging at this point. We'll occasionally go back to those other flatbed scanners if we just need to do a one-off, and maybe we don't want to spend as much time as it takes to kind of get to get everything white balanced and all that. But for the most part, we're going with the PhaseOne, and then all those processes that were previously managed in IrfanView and Photoshop and having to bring in the advanced renamer occasionally, all that work is now being done in Capture One, which we love. We're really happy with that software solution. And then as soon as that's over with, we can cast all the different derivatives that we create in the export functions of Capture One. Those are off to the servers, and we're ready to begin the cataloging process using the access copies of these images. So what has that allowed us to do? Well, there's two big changes. Obviously, it has expanded the range of physical formats that we can digitize. We can now get, we've been able to get giant wall-sized maps that people were using to map out voting precincts, and you know, some of our large format maps that were used for like navigational charts and things dating back to, you know, several centuries ago. So that has been a huge improvement for us. And the fact that even, you know, we were able to scan some of those things before, but then having to stitch it all together was very time consuming. Being able to get all of that instantaneously with the PhaseOne camera has just been amazing. But now there's another piece to that I'd like to focus on, and that is that we're able to use the extra time because we do have a small staff, and so much of our time was going into imaging before now that we weren't able to be very super creative. We had enough time to image the stuff, catalog the stuff, and get it online. But now we're able to devote a little bit more time to outreach and building partnerships with people around the state who either we might want to build digitization partnerships with, or we might be able to partner with them to do some crowdsourcing for our cataloging and transcription and indexing. So I want to walk you through a couple of examples of how we've done that. The best example I can think of to start with here is a series of records called the State and County Officer Directories. They're not terribly complex records. Our Secretary of State, since the territorial days of Florida, has always maintained an index of who all the different county officers are at the county level. And then, of course, all the state officers, because they have to know when someone was commissioned and when the end of their commission is going to go. And you would think that this information would already be, you know, indexed and out there and easy to grab. Our reference desk will assure you it is not. The individual counties don't actually keep up with this information because the commissions don't come from the county. All of our county commissioners and sheriffs and school board members and all that stuff, they get their commissions from the state government. So those records only exist in their entirety at the state level in the original. And so, as you can imagine, these records have tremendous historical and genealogical value. That's one of our biggest constituencies is genealogists. So we've been going through, and with the PhaseOne, because these are in bound volumes, it's never been safe for us to use flatbed scanners to do this. We really need to be scanning from above rather than from below. And so now that we have the PhaseOne and the DT Versa, we're able to go in and scan these relatively rapidly. It's only taken a few months to get the remainder of the objects scanned in. And we've been able to use the extra time to recruit and train a whole corps of digital volunteers all around the state and really all around the country who have been helping us to get this stuff in. And because these records are organized county by county, we're able to actually assign people to segments of the records that are relevant to their own experiences. So genealogists, they love working with materials from the places where they have family members or where they are helping someone else track down family members. And so we have been able to actually take the time to go in, divvy up the records and send them to people who really have a vested interest in making sure that these materials are indexed correctly. And those partnerships are absolutely invaluable because the relationship may start with helping us do some indexing. But then sometimes it ends with them, us having conversations by email and saying, and them saying, hey, I've got this, I actually have pictures of this guy. Would you like pictures of this person? And of course, our answer is yes, and then we explain the process. Sometimes we get originals out of it. Sometimes we do a loan and we create digital copies that we acquire that way. But this has turned into outreach presentations where we've been able to go on site, and then of course, now with COVID, we're doing most of these virtually through Zoom now. But this has just opened up so many wonderful things, and it all started with changes to our digitization workflow, freeing up time on our staff. A couple more kinds of records that we're going to be using this same sort of outreach workflow. It's as much as an outreach workflow as it is digital at this point, but tax rolls and agricultural schedules. Florida is one of the few states where the National Archives does not actually have the original copies of our agricultural schedules to the federal census that's done every 10 years. And so since that's not available anywhere else aside from microfilm, we're going ahead and digitizing the originals that we hold here at the archives so that those will be available and just as pretty as the ones as you can get for other states in the original. And these tax rolls, these are fantastic. Great things, because these are made every year. The census is only made every 10 years. So by getting these tax rolls in there and other great big name-based, very info-rich collections, we're able to give genealogists and local historians many more data points to do their research. The other project that I thought would be interesting to highlight, just a little bit of background on that. So I mentioned earlier that the State Archives of Florida, we only digitize materials that are ours, even if what is ours is actually a digital copy of what's in another repository. And we only do those partnerships when we feel like the other repository is just not going to have the wherewithal to be able to provide proper access on their own. And one of our key constituencies where that is the case is, I mentioned that a lot of the local records in Florida are maintained in local county courthouses. What I mean by this is, by local records, is things like land records, deeds, mortgages, wills, and estate documentation, and local court proceedings and things like this. Now, Ancestry and Family Search and big databases like this, they have digitized the microfilm versions that were produced by the LDS Church many years ago. They have digitized a lot of the microfilm versions of these records, but sometimes they just haven't been indexed yet. Sometimes there's some problems with the indexing. Sometimes the original, the microfilmed images that these bigger database folks, Ancestry and Family Search, are working from, sometimes there's some problems with the quality. And so what we're doing is there's no way we'll be able to go back and do what the LDS Church did in the 50s and 60s and take all 67 counties in Florida and digitally image all of their stuff, nor would we need to. Some of the bigger counties are doing that work on their own, but there are a lot of counties in our area that are rural, very rural. They don't have the staff, they don't have the money, they don't have the equipment to do digitization on their own. And so with the extra time that we have on our hands from being able to digitize materials so much snappier, we're beginning to reach out to some of these courthouses that have really old, rare records that we know are not necessarily stored in the best archival conditions. And we're able to reach out and say, hey, can we perhaps maybe get a visit, and can we maybe get you some acid-free enclosures for these records? Can we maybe do a digitization partnership? And most of the time they're very happy to do that. It's a win-win situation because of course we give them both preservation and access grade copies to everything that we digitize. We get that as well, which means we can make them available on the Florida Memory website. We give it our indexing treatment. We have an amazing systems analyst who has done some really incredible work making these records just about as user-friendly as what you encounter on Ancestry and Family Search. And so we're pretty proud of being able to do that. One example just recently, just to give you one data point, of one collection where we've been able to do that. One of our counties off to the east a little bit, Madison County, they're kind of in that situation where they're quite rural. Their clerk of courts is very interested in preserving these materials. He just doesn't have the staff, the time, the equipment right now to go in and digitize these records that go all the way back to the 1830s. And so what we've done is we've created sort of this revolving door where every couple of months, when we have some time on our calendar, we grab a couple of volumes from the county courthouse. We digitize them here at the state archives, and then we get those back to the clerk because we do prefer for local records to rest where they're from. That's generally best for everybody. But by having those digital records here, we're able to index them because we have this core of digital volunteers that's very interested in doing that. And we're able to get this material out to the public so it can be used. And then we can use it as well in our outreach that we do, particularly with genealogists and teachers and students. For example, in the record that we're looking at here, this is a mortgage where the person taking out the mortgage here was actually mortgaging enslaved individuals. And this record, this kind of record is so important because it's so hard to find records that name enslaved individuals by name prior to emancipation. And so, you know, this one, it's got information in here about the name of a man who's named Cupid here. It gives family relationships. We've got his wife, Kate. We've got kids. You know, there is nothing quite like the federal census for enslaved individuals. And so records like this, while, you know, they're sitting in stacks in courthouses all over Florida and other states, of course, they have this amazing information in there, but by getting at least copies of them into an archival setting, like the State Archives of Florida, we're able to get this information out there and to actually put it into our outreach queue so that we're able to get them to their fullest use and give them their fullest potential. So I guess the name of the game, in a word, has been partnerships. You know, by streamlining our digitization workflow, we're able to spend so much more of our time dealing with the part of our mission that frankly is the most important. And that is to get these materials out to the people who can use them for historical analysis and writing and teaching. And so we're very proud to be able to do this. Now, these have only been just a couple of examples. We've already digitized so much material with our PhaseOne and our DT Versa. But I hope that if you have any questions about how we've been able to achieve this and how we've sort of been thinking about digitization as just one step leading us into this larger part of our mission, sharing all this material, we'd love to hear from you. This is my contact information. And then, of course, I'll be around in the breakout session and with questions. And Pete, I think we're at time.
You did an amazing job getting all that information in that time sequence. That was awesome. Great presentation, Josh. Thank you. So we now have time for some Q&A. We got one right away here. Do you also have, this is from Jennifer Sullivan, do you also have archives, the electronic communications such as emails, texts for the government officials, or is that a different division altogether?
No, that comes here as well. And in fact, the majority, I wouldn't say majority. I'd have to speak with our collections management team to say that for sure. I will say that a very large proportion of the records that are coming to us now from recent years in the various cabinet agencies that deposit records here, they're coming to us electronically. And of course, those get stored off in the cloud with redundancy.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple questions for you.
Sure.
You said early on you did some conversion back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's like FADG compliancy. There's I keep forgetting the ISO number for it, but it's the Metamorphose and FADG have combined to an ISO standard. When you were doing those back in the 90s, were there any guidelines that you were using, or they were more of an ad hoc approach? I'm curious about all that.
I wish I had our program director who founded the program here to sort of ask about that. I will say that I've heard her say in many cases during other presentations similar to this that they did a lot of kind of making things up in the early days, sort of making things up as they went along, just because there weren't a lot of other folks doing this where we were able to spend a lot of time sitting down with them. But as soon as we could get into FADGI compliance, I know that we started doing that. Now, the technical side of that, our program director mainly monitors for compliance with those standards. But, and I will say, I mentioned earlier that we've done a lot of rescanning. Obviously, as standards have increased, we've found that even when we were adhering to broader standards in the 90s and early 2000s, where a lot of our images were out of compliance, as we moved into the 2010s. And so we've done a lot of rescanning over the past few years, particularly with photographs, but it's starting to get to where textual records too. The resolution of textual records is far below standard for some of the older collections.
Do you feel that was more of knowledge of the team, the technology being used, combination of both?
Some of that, and again, I'd have to speak with the folks who were there at that time. We've had, there's been a number of folks turn over since then, but we still do maintain contact with some of our folks who were here in the 90s. And I think that in the early days, it probably was, sort of coming to the realization that there were enough people doing digitization, even in the mid 90s when we got this started, that there were standards that we should be complying with, particularly if we wanted to be applying for certain kinds of grants. And IMLS, of course, they set that they expect that we're not just throwing things in a scanner, that we're actually adhering to some standards. So I think in the early days, it probably was just the ad hoc bit, but then later on, it became important to really monitor what we were doing for standards compliance.
So I gotta keep going on the whole standards thing just for another minute or so, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Now, obviously, unique materials, it's very easy to justify a higher grade or higher grade guideline, whether it's FADGI 3 or FADGI 4. But what about more generic material, or you don't archive that stuff?
By generic material, do you mean sort of maybe routine correspondence? That doesn't necessarily represent some great momentous milestone in Florida history or something like that.
Or just regular text on paper for doing data extraction and things of that nature.
Now, if we digitize something, if we digitize something in the Florida Memory Program, it's going to the fullest extent of our standards for textual records. So it's going to get a preservation master that's going to be done at minimum 600 DPI. And then, there's, the color depth and all that stuff. We're going to do it for full standards. If it's going to go on the website, it doesn't matter what kind of record it is. Okay. Now, there are other parts of the house. There are other parts of the shop here in the archives that do a different kind of digitization. For example, we are a state repository for what's called post-conviction records. I'm butchering the name of this repository, I'm sure, but what essentially it is a repository for all of the paperwork associated with any kind of court case that results in the death penalty or life in prison. And so we maintain all those records here. And the purpose of having them in one place is so that if any of the parties to the legal work associated with those cases, if they need copies, rather than having to go to 15 different law enforcement agencies, they come to us and we've got copies of all of it. That digitization does not go to any FADGI standard that I'm aware of. Okay. So there is that. But if Florida Memory is going to touch it, it's going to go to full standards.
So you have the different pipelines depending on the material type. That makes sense.
That's right. That's right.
We have a question from Stuart Rufford. Way to go, Josh, is what he says. Really interesting stuff. Are you encountering any Keystone curving issues when digitizing books on the Versa? He says he's looking into getting a Versa at his studio at FSU. Maybe he wants to schedule a visit to take a look at your machine.
Absolutely, we would love that. And to answer your question, when there's a really severe gutter, in the books, which does happen a lot of times, because these books, of course, are not being, they're not being bound with future digitization in mind. They're being bound with preservation, with no regard for digitization. So we are hitting a lot of volumes where we do have some gutter issues. And we've played around with a few different methods for doing that. Depending on the kind of stitching, sometimes we've just gone ahead and worked with collections management to say, since it's a preservation issue here, can we disbind this? We have disbound some things, but that's of course only in cases where we've looked at it very carefully and said, okay, in the long term, these records, it's going to be better for handling anyway if we get rid of this saddle stitching or whatever. And so we have disbound some things. Other things, we have just done the best that we can, and we're still kind of experimenting. Remember, we've only had this since November of 2020 is when we first started operating. So we're still kind of fooling around with the settings. And but we'd love to have folks who are in the Tallahassee area or even farther away, please do stop by, and we'd be glad to gab about how we're finding solutions.
That's great. I have another question from Jairo Orleana. How do you manage so much data in big files?
So much data in big files. So
and big files, both.
And big files. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of how we manage so much data, yes, because like the slides aren't shared anymore, but if you remember that the first book that I talked about, those state and county officer directories, that is a massive collection data wise, because there's more than 100,000 names, or rather 100,000 instances of office holding. Sometimes you get people who do multiple terms. So it's not 100,000 people, but it's 100,000 instances of office holding. And for every one of those, we're capturing dates and names and notes that are in the book and notes that were taken down by us. And then we've got internal metadata elements that we're keeping on that as well. It's probably in the millions and millions of cells that we're talking about. And so we do data capture in Google Sheets because we're doing this collaboratively with lots of folks. We're about to transition to a system. We've actually commissioned a group called Brumfield Labs and there's actually several folks in the Council of State Archivists who's doing this. We've worked with them to create an add-on to their program called From the Page. You may have encountered it, those of you who have crowdsourcing programs for digitization. But we manage the data capture process through Google Sheets right now. It'll soon be moving into From the Page. But even then, once we get it out of From the Page, it'll go into Google Sheets. We find that is the best for these table data based collections. That seems to be the best place to kind of assemble everything. And then that all gets chopped up into catalog records, whatever the records are going to be. Sometimes we go by volume, sometimes we stitch pieces of volumes together to go by county. We focus very much on what's going to be best for the user experience, which sometimes takes us out of the way archivists would traditionally organize digital records, because it doesn't always mirror the organization in the physical format perfectly. But what we do is we map every line, every item, everything is mapped to a unique identifier that if we look at that, it gives us a digital breadcrumb trail right back to where the thing comes from in the physical. So even though we are kind of swapping things around and rearranging stuff somewhat unusually for a digital repository, for an archive, we do still have pretty tight control on where everything comes from. But yeah, Google Sheets is where that goes. And then for presentation, we use an Omeka installation. And then we do a mass import into Omeka. Our systems analyst handles that part.
Awesome. Well, we're at the end of our Q&A.